The Pacific skies were once dominated by Japanese pilots who believed in their Zero's unmatched agility and speed. But when the American F4U Corsair entered the war, the rules of aerial combat changed forever. Its bent wings, raw power, and deadly firepower turned it into a predator the Japanese could neither escape nor defeat. For the men who once flew with pride, the Corsair became a nightmare, a machine that climbed higher, flew faster, and struck harder than anything they had ever faced. This is the untold story of how the Corsair broke Japan's confidence in the air and left enemy pilots terrified in their cockpits. The legend of the Japanese Zero and its early dominance began in the skies over China before America even entered the war, when pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy stunned the world with a fighter that seemed untouchable. Light, fast, agile, and with incredible range, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was a nightmare for opponents who found themselves locked in combat against it. When the Pacific War erupted after Pearl Harbor, the Zero was already a proven machine, and its reputation only grew as Japanese pilots slashed through American and Allied aircraft with ruthless efficiency. Stories spread quickly among U.S. aviators. Whispers that the Zero could turn tighter than anything in the sky, that its range allowed it to strike from nowhere, and that its pilots were willing to die before being beaten. Fear spread as quickly as the machine itself, and in those opening months of the war, Japan controlled the air, demoralizing its enemies with what seemed like an unstoppable weapon. In early battles, U.S. pilots flying the outdated Brewster Buffalo and the Grumman F4F Wildcat struggled to match the Zero's nimble maneuvers. Dogfights often turned into desperate struggles where the only hope was to dive away, praying the heavier American planes could outlast the Zero's climb or find safety before being riddled with 7.7 mm and 20 mm cannon fire. On the ground, military planners and engineers scrambled to understand this new threat. When a mostly intact Zero crash landed on Akutan Island in the Aleutians in 1942, it became one of the most valuable prizes of the war. Engineers examined the fighter closely, pulling apart its secrets and learning both its strengths and its weaknesses. They discovered what Japanese pilots already knew: the Zero was powerful but fragile. Its lightweight design sacrificed armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, meaning a single burst of heavy fire could turn it into a fireball. Yet even with that knowledge, Allied pilots still had to survive long enough to exploit those weaknesses, and for much of 1942 and into 1943, that was no easy task. The myth of the Zero was not only mechanical but psychological. Japanese propaganda celebrated the plane as a symbol of the empire's strength, while Allied newspapers painted it as a near-invincible foe. The psychological weight hung heavily on new pilots sent into the Pacific. Stories circulated of Zeros diving out of the sun, swarming in coordinated attacks, or performing maneuvers that seemed impossible to counter. The Zero became a ghost in the minds of American aviators, a predator always waiting for its chance. For Japanese pilots, the machine was more than a tool. It was a source of pride, a fighter that embodied their belief in the Bushido spirit. They felt invincible, and in the early years of the war, they had reason to believe it, but legends are fragile when reality changes. By late 1942, cracks in the Zero's dominance began to show. American tactics improved, with experienced pilots like John Thatch developing the Thack Weave, a defensive maneuver that allowed slower, less agile planes to cover each other against the Zero's turns. The introduction of newer Allied fighters like the P-38 Lightning and the F-6F Hellcat began to shift the balance, but it was the arrival of the American F4U Corsair that transformed the battlefield entirely. For the Japanese, the moment they realized their Zero could neither outclimb, outrun, nor outgun the Corsair was the moment the myth of their aerial supremacy began to collapse. The story of the Zero's early dominance is essential, because it explains why the appearance of the Corsair was so devastating. Japanese pilots had lived for years believing their plane was unmatched, and many entered battle with the same mindset even in 1943 and 1944. Yet with each clash, they began to learn that the Corsair could dive faster, pull away in a climb, and unleash a torrent of machine gunfire that shredded their fragile aircraft. What had once been a duel between equal opponents was quickly becoming a slaughter, and the psychological shock was immense. Japanese pilots who had once hunted now found themselves being hunted, and the terror of the Corsair spread through their ranks, just as the legend of the Zero once had among the Americans. It was this transformation, from hunter to hunted, that defined the shift in air power over the Pacific. The Zero had been born into an era when Japan's enemies were unprepared, undertrained, and poorly equipped. By the time the Corsair arrived, the Americans had learned hard lessons, trained new pilots with those lessons in mind, and built machines designed to exploit every weakness the Zero carried. The once proud symbol of Japanese dominance was now a reminder of obsolescence, a fragile relic in a war that demanded power, speed, and survival. And for those Japanese pilots who strapped into their Zeros and faced the bent, winged Corsair in the sky, the fear was real. They knew before the fight even began that they were outmatched, and in that knowledge lay the beginning of defeat. The introduction of the F4U Corsair and its revolutionary design marked a turning point in the Pacific Air War, a moment when American engineering finally produced a machine capable of not only matching but utterly surpassing the Zero. From the moment the Corsair rolled out of Vaught's factory, its appearance alone made it stand apart. Those inverted gull wings, bent downward before sharply rising, looked almost unnatural at first, but every line of the design had a purpose. The bent wings allowed the Corsair to accommodate one of the most powerful engines of the war, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial, which in turn drove a massive propeller more than 13 feet in diameter. Without the gull wings, the landing gear would have been too tall and fragile to support such a beast, but with them, the Corsair stood firm, ready to unleash its full power. For pilots who first laid eyes on it, the Corsair looked less like a fighter and more like a predator, something built to dominate the skies rather than merely survive in them. Its performance figures told the story as clearly as its appearance. While the Japanese Zero could reach speeds of around 330 miles per hour, the Corsair tore through the air at more than 400, easily leaving its rival behind in level flight. Where the Zero depended on agility and lightweight construction to win dogfights, the Corsair embraced brute strength, using raw horsepower and aerodynamic refinement to create a fighter that could dictate the terms of engagement. It was the fastest carrier-based fighter of its time, a machine that made even the celebrated Hellcat seem tame by comparison. Pilots quickly discovered that they could use speed to choose when to fight and when to disengage, something Japanese aviators could never do in their increasingly outdated Zeros. Once the Corsair appeared in numbers, the balance of the Pacific skies began to shift inexorably in America's favor. But the Corsair was more than just speed. Its climb rate stunned opponents who had long believed the Zero's ability to claw into the sky was unmatched. With the R2800's roar behind them, Corsair pilots could rocket upward, leaving their Japanese pursuers struggling helplessly below. For decades, Japanese training had emphasized the confidence that came from knowing one's machine could always outclimb and outturn the enemy. Suddenly, that confidence evaporated as the Corsair defied the very laws of aerial dueling that Japanese pilots had been taught to trust. The sense of security they once felt in vertical maneuvers became a trap, one that often ended with the Corsair diving down upon them from above. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns ready to deliver devastating burst firepower was another revelation. Where the Zero carried two 20mm cannons and a pair of machine guns but sacrificed ammunition and reliability for lightness, the Corsair's 6 Browning .50 calibers brought a steady stream of destruction that could cut through enemy aircraft with merciless efficiency. Japanese pilots quickly learned that the Corsair could take hits they could not. American engineers had armored the cockpit, strengthened the wings, and installed self-sealing fuel tanks, features the Zero lacked. In a head-on clash, the Corsair was not only faster and tougher but more lethal. Japanese pilots, who once dove boldly into frontal engagements, began to hesitate, knowing that what awaited them was likely a storm of gunfire their fragile machines could not withstand. It was not just a tactical disadvantage, it was a psychological one. Each time they chose to disengage rather than face the Corsair head-on, the myth of their invincibility eroded a little further. Yet the Corsair's revolutionary design did not come without challenges. In its early days, carrier landings were notoriously difficult. The long nose of the Corsair stretched out ahead of the cockpit, creating blind spots that made it hard to judge approaches. Its powerful engine and massive propeller also produced torque that could flip the plane if handled carelessly. Early accidents led some to doubt whether the Corsair could truly serve as a carrier fighter, and for a time, many were delivered to Marine squadrons operating from island airstrips rather than the decks of carriers. But necessity, training, and adaptation soon overcame those difficulties. Pilots learned new landing techniques. Engineers made refinements to the airframe, and before long, the Corsair was flying from carriers with deadly efficiency. Its difficulties only added to its legend, for it became known as a pilot's plane. A machine that demanded skill but rewarded mastery with unmatched performance in combat. When the Corsair finally entered combat in the Pacific, it made its presence known immediately. Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to seeing Wildcats and other slower American planes suddenly found themselves facing an adversary that roared into battle with terrifying speed and power. Accounts spread quickly among Japanese units of encounters where Zeros were outpaced, outclimbed, and shredded by bursts of heavy fire from the bent, winged beast. Fear crept into their ranks just as fear had once spread among American pilots in the early days of the Zero. In many ways, the Corsair was more than an aircraft. It was a symbol of momentum shifting, of American industry and ingenuity finally producing the edge that would carry them toward victory. To the Japanese, it felt as though the sky itself had betrayed them, no longer a realm where their training and machines gave them superiority, but a battlefield where the Corsair reigned supreme. The revolutionary design of the Corsair did more than simply win dogfights. It shattered the balance of power in the Pacific Air War. For every Japanese pilot who looked up and saw those bent wings slicing through the sky, there was the dawning realization that the days of Zero dominance were over. What had once been an age of Japanese aerial supremacy was giving way to an era defined by American machines built for speed, power, and survival. The Corsair represented not just a weapon but a statement, a declaration that the Allies would no longer fight from behind. With every clash in the Pacific, the revolutionary design of the Corsair proved that the war in the air had changed forever, and the terror it inspired in Japanese pilots was as much about what it symbolized as what it could do in the sky. Speed was the Corsair's greatest weapon, the advantage that changed every rule of combat in the Pacific skies. From the very first tests, it became clear that this fighter was unlike anything the Japanese had faced before. With its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine pushing out more than 2,000 horsepower, the Corsair could streak through the air at over 400 miles per hour. For comparison, the Zero, once feared as the fastest machine in the Pacific, barely touched 330. That difference might seem small on paper, but in the chaos of aerial battle it was everything. Speed meant the Corsair could dictate the fight, choosing when to strike and when to vanish, never forced into a duel it did not want. For Japanese pilots, who had once relied on agility and the element of surprise, the realization that their enemy could simply accelerate away left them shaken. In the early war years, American pilots flying Wildcats and Buffaloes had learned to dread prolonged engagements. If a Zero was on your tail, your only hope was a steep dive and the prayer that gravity would pull you fast enough to escape. With the Corsair, that desperate dive became unnecessary. A push of the throttle and the Zero was left behind, its engine screaming in vain as it tried to keep pace. Corsair pilots quickly discovered the psychological impact of this ability. When Japanese fighters appeared to pounce, the Corsair could simply sprint away, regroup, and then return at an angle and time of its choosing. Japanese pilots who were used to cornering their prey suddenly found themselves chasing ghosts, their confidence crumbling as they watched American fighters slip from their grasp. Speed also meant attack on the Corsair's terms. American pilots no longer needed to circle endlessly in tight turns where the Zero held the advantage. Instead, they adopted boom and zoom tactics, diving down at high speed, unleashing a burst of .50 caliber fire, and then climbing away before the enemy could react. The Corsair speed turned every attack into a hammer blow, delivered from above with brutal efficiency. Japanese pilots would turn desperately, hoping to catch the Corsair in a sustained fight, but the American machine was already climbing back into the clouds, untouchable. This pattern repeated again and again in the skies of the Solomons and the Marshalls, each encounter reminding Japanese aviators that their beloved Zero could no longer command the air the way it once had. The psychological toll was immense. For years, Japanese pilots had been told that their training, discipline, and aircraft gave them supremacy over their enemies. They believed they could always outmaneuver and outfight the Americans, and for a time they could. But when the Corsair appeared, those beliefs were stripped away in brutal fashion. Suddenly, the hunter became the hunted. Corsairs could dive onto formations of Zeros, strike and vanish before counterattacks could even form. Reports from surviving Japanese pilots often spoke of the frustration of chasing shadows, of seeing their targets slip away time and again. Fear crept in as they realized that once the Corsair entered a fight, escape was nearly impossible. The speed advantage made disengagement an American privilege, not theirs for the men flying the Corsair. Speed was more than just a technical advantage. It was a lifeline. They knew they had a weapon the enemy could not match, and with that weapon came confidence. It allowed inexperienced pilots to survive their first battles, and it gave veterans the ability to press attacks with ruthless precision. That confidence in turn translated into higher morale and more aggressive tactics. Where once American aviators had fought defensively, clinging to survival, they now surged into battle with the knowledge that they held the upper hand. Speed changed not only the physics of combat, but the very spirit of the men who fought it. Speed also had a practical advantage beyond dogfighting. It gave Corsair pilots the ability to escort bombers deeper into Japanese territory, keeping pace with larger formations and fending off interceptors. The Zero's lack of raw speed meant it struggled to intercept American raids, and when it did, the Corsairs were waiting, ready to strike. Japanese commanders, once confident that their Zeros could sweep the skies clear, found themselves scrambling to adapt to an enemy that seemed always one step ahead. Missions that had once been routine became increasingly dangerous, and losses mounted as the Corsair's speed advantage turned every encounter into a deadly mismatch. By late 1943 and into 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever the Corsair flew, Japanese pilots found themselves outpaced, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The terror was no longer in the turning duels they had once dominated, but in the sudden, brutal strikes they could neither predict nor escape. Speed gave the Corsair not just superiority, but inevitability. It was a predator against prey that could neither flee nor fight back effectively. The Japanese soon learned to dread the sound of its engine, the bent, winged silhouette flashing across the sky, because they knew what followed was a strike they could not outrun. In the end, speed was the element that broke the myth of Japanese invincibility in the air. It allowed the Corsair to dictate combat, to strike without warning, and to retreat at will. It gave American pilots the ability to flip the balance of power in the Pacific, to transform fear into dominance. And for the Japanese pilots who once soared with confidence, speed became the measure of their downfall, a constant reminder that their days of superiority were over. The Corsair had arrived, and the Pacific skies would never again belong to the Zero. The climb rate of the Corsair was another revelation that shattered the confidence of Japanese pilots who had once relied on the Zero's ability to claw its way into the sky with unmatched grace. For years, the vertical fight had been the Zero's realm, a place where Japanese aviators felt untouchable. They had trained endlessly to use climbs and loops to gain the advantage, believing no enemy could follow them upward without stalling or falling away. When the Corsair entered the skies, that assumption died. Powered by its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp, the Corsair surged upward with raw, unrelenting force, climbing faster and higher than the fragile Zero could ever hope to achieve. This change in vertical performance transformed the battlefield, giving American pilots a new dimension of control and taking away the one maneuver Japanese pilots had trusted above all others in dogfights. The ability to climb was not just a technical number written on a chart. It was survival. The Corsair's climb rate meant that after making a slashing attack, its pilots could point the nose skyward and rocket out of danger, climbing back into the sun or the clouds where Japanese pursuers could not follow. Zeros that tried to chase often stalled or simply fell back, their lightweight frames unable to match the sheer horsepower that carried the Corsair into safety. For American pilots, this was more than just a way to disengage, it was a weapon. They could use the climb as a shield, daring Japanese pilots to give chase, and then punishing them when their planes faltered in the attempt. Every time a Zero tried to match the Corsair in the vertical, it became a target, hanging helplessly for a moment before being torn apart by machine gunfire from above. The climb also meant that Corsair pilots could seize the high ground before the battle even began. In air combat, altitude was life. To hold the skies above your opponent was to hold the initiative, the power to dive when you wished and attack from a position of strength. With the Corsair's climb, American pilots could reach those heights quickly, establishing dominance before Japanese formations had even settled into their patrols. Pilots spoke of the confidence that came from looking down on their enemies, knowing they held the advantage, knowing they could swoop at will, and then claw their way back into safety with a burst of engine power. Japanese pilots who once owned that advantage now found themselves staring upward at predators circling above them, waiting for the moment to strike for the Japanese. This was not merely a tactical problem, it was a crisis of belief. Their training had drilled into them the supremacy of the Zero's agility, the idea that skill and maneuver could overcome brute force. The vertical fight was at the heart of that philosophy. To suddenly find that the enemy could climb faster, could rise higher, could leave them struggling below, it tore at the very foundation of their doctrine. Many Japanese aviators described the frustration of pulling their sticks back, coaxing their Zeros into the sky, only to watch the Corsair continue upward with ease, its engine roaring, its silhouette shrinking into the distance. In those moments, they knew the battle was already lost, because once the Corsair owned the high ground, it owned the fight. The climb rate also gave American pilots new tactics that played directly against Japanese weaknesses. The Zero's lack of armor and limited power meant that in prolonged climbs or dives, it quickly lost energy. Corsair pilots exploited this ruthlessly, drawing their enemies into vertical duels they could never win. An American pilot could make a fast pass, climb steeply, and then roll over into another diving attack while the Japanese pilot, forced to maneuver harder, bled away speed and altitude until he was left vulnerable. This cycle repeated across countless engagements, each time hammering home the lesson that the old ways no longer worked, that the Corsair had redefined the very shape of combat in the Pacific skies. Eyewitness accounts from both sides speak to the demoralizing effect of this superiority. American pilots often described the exhilaration of feeling raw power beneath them, the sense that no matter what the enemy tried, they could always escape upward into safety. Japanese survivors, on the other hand, recalled the despair of watching their opponents climb out of reach, untouchable and uncatchable. That despair was more than personal. It spread through entire units, eroding morale, replacing pride with resignation. Pilots who once believed they were masters of the vertical fight now hesitated, aware that every attempt to climb might be the last mistake they ever made. In practical terms, the Corsair's climb rate also meant greater versatility in battle. It allowed the fighter to respond quickly to threats, to race upward and intercept bombers or attackers before they could strike. It allowed squadrons to cover larger areas of sky, climbing and diving to meet enemies across vast distances. The Zero, with its more modest performance, could not match that flexibility. As the war dragged on, this meant Japanese forces were not only losing dogfights, they were losing control of the skies altogether, unable to protect their bombers, their ships, or even their own bases from the relentless reach of the Corsair by late 1943 and into 1944. The climb rate of the Corsair had become legendary among American pilots and infamous among their enemies. It was part of the aura of invincibility that surrounded the bent, winged bird, part of the reason Japanese aviators began to dread encounters with it. Every time they looked upward and saw a Corsair perched above, they knew what was coming: a dive they could not stop, an attack they could not evade, and a climb back to safety that they could never match. The skies that had once been their domain now belonged to someone else, and the climb of the Corsair was the key to that transformation, the story of climb superiority was not just about numbers on performance charts. It was about dominance, about who controlled the battlefield and who dictated the terms of combat. With the Corsair's climb, American pilots seized that control and never gave it back. For Japanese pilots, the lesson was learned in fear and fire, in the helplessness of watching an enemy rise above them and knowing there was nothing they could do. It was the end of an era, the collapse of a doctrine, and the birth of a new reality where the Corsair ruled the vertical just as surely as it ruled the horizontal. The war in the Pacific would never again be the same. The firepower of the Corsair was the element that delivered the most immediate and shocking blow to Japanese pilots who had spent years fighting opponents with less devastating weaponry. 6 Browning, 50 caliber M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, gave the Corsair an unmatched wall of lead that could tear through the sky with devastating accuracy and sustained fury. Each gun spat bullets at a blistering rate, and when combined, they produced a storm of fire that few aircraft of the era could withstand. Against the lightly built and poorly protected Zero, this was not just an advantage, it was slaughter. The Zero had been designed around speed and agility, with sacrifices made in armor, protection, and survivability. Its lack of self-sealing fuel tanks, its fragile frame, and its absence of pilot armor all made it catastrophically vulnerable. When a Corsair opened up, the Zero stood little chance of surviving more than a single burst. In the early war years, Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to the relative weakness of American aircraft armament. Wildcats carried 4.50 calibers at best, and though effective, they did not produce the overwhelming streams of fire that the Corsair could unleash. When the bent, wing bird entered combat, the difference was immediately felt. American pilots, once forced to hold their fire until dangerously close, could now engage from greater distances, confident that their 6 heavy machine guns would deliver enough concentrated destruction to tear enemy planes apart. Japanese aviators who had once been able to weave, dodge, and escape bursts of fire now found themselves shredded by a torrent they could neither avoid nor outlast. The psychological shock was immense. For Japanese pilots, the knowledge that a single hit could ignite their fuel tanks or splinter their wings was always present. But against the Corsair it became a near certainty. Survivors often recalled the fear of seeing tracer lines stretch across the sky, each glowing streak a marker of death. They spoke of comrades disappearing in sudden blossoms of flame, their planes consumed instantly by the concentrated firepower of the American machine. That fear eroded confidence, forcing many to break off engagements earlier, to avoid head-on attacks, or to flee at the first sign of the Corsair's approach. In aerial combat, where confidence and aggression often determined the outcome, that hesitation was fatal for American pilots. The firepower gave a sense of invincibility. They no longer needed to rely on pinpoint precision or extended bursts in hopes of a lucky strike. A single pass, a short burst was often enough. Reports of kills with less than 3 seconds of fire became common, a testament to the devastating combination of 6 guns, delivering more than 7,000 rounds per minute. Pilots described the satisfaction of watching enemy planes disintegrate under their guns, wings snapping, fuel tanks igniting, cockpits exploding into debris. It was not just efficiency, it was overwhelming superiority, and it gave Corsair squadrons the confidence to attack aggressively, knowing that once they lined up a target, destruction was almost guaranteed. The presence of such firepower also changed tactics. Corsair pilots did not need to linger in turning duels, where the Zero might hold an edge in maneuverability. They could strike in fast, slashing attacks, unleash a withering burst, and climb away, leaving their enemy broken or burning. The effectiveness of these attacks grew even more pronounced when Corsair squadrons operated in groups, each aircraft pouring fire into Japanese formations, overwhelming them with sheer volume. Against such concentrated fury, Japanese units began to crumble, unable to withstand the punishment. Losses mounted, and with each engagement, the terror of facing the Corsair's guns spread further through Japanese ranks. The fragility of the Zero made the firepower disparity even more brutal. Japanese designers had built the Zero for agility and range, stripping it of anything that added unnecessary weight. Armor plates to protect the pilot were left out. self-sealing fuel tanks, common in American planes, were omitted. The airframe itself was thin and light, optimized for speed at the cost of resilience. This design philosophy had worked in the early years, when the Zero faced weaker opponents, but against the Corsair it was catastrophic. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could rip through the entire fuselage, ignite fuel tanks, and leave the plane a fireball within seconds. Many Japanese pilots never had a chance to bail out. Their planes disintegrated too quickly. This reality haunted every engagement, turning every encounter with a Corsair into a gamble of life or death weighted heavily against them. The contrast between the two machines symbolized the larger conflict. The Zero represented the early war, fast, light, and deadly, but ultimately fragile and unsustainable. The Corsair represented the industrial might of America, combining speed, armor, and overwhelming firepower into a package designed to dominate. Each clash between them was more than just a duel of machines. It was a contest of philosophies, and the Corsair's guns wrote the verdict in fire and steel. Japanese pilots who once believed in the invincibility of their design now faced the undeniable truth that their planes were no match for the firepower roaring from the wings of the bent, wing-bird witnesses from the Pacific. Often described the skies lit by burning wreckage, the trails of smoke marking where Zeros had fallen. American reports boasted of kill ratios climbing ever higher, some squadrons claiming 5 or 6 victories in a single sortie. While exaggeration was always possible in the heat of war, the fact remained undeniable: the Corsair's firepower was a decisive advantage that turned battles and eroded enemy morale. For Japanese commanders, the mounting losses were devastating. Each pilot lost was nearly irreplaceable, the product of years of training and experience. While American replacements arrived in steady streams, the firepower of the Corsair not only destroyed machines, it destroyed Japan's ability to sustain the fight. By 1944, the reputation of the Corsair's guns was well established. Japanese pilots often avoided head-on engagements, knowing that the Corsair would almost always win the exchange. Many chose to break off fights early, preserving their lives but conceding the skies. This shift in behavior reflected the deeper truth: the firepower disparity had broken their spirit. The skies, once a place of confidence and daring, had become a killing ground dominated by the Corsair's relentless wall of lead. The fear of those 6.50 calibers was etched into every mission, every encounter, a constant reminder that the days of Japanese dominance were over in the end. The Corsair's firepower did more than secure victories. It symbolized the transformation of the Pacific War. Where once the Japanese had dictated the pace and terms of combat, now the Americans held every advantage, and the Corsair's guns were the most visible, most feared embodiment of that shift. To the men who faced them, the firepower was not just a technical statistic, it was the roar of death in the skies, a sound that meant their time was short and their fate already sealed. Japanese pilots' psychological fear of the Corsair's resilience was something that went far beyond the technical comparisons of performance charts and kill ratios. It lived in their hearts and minds, shaping every engagement in the skies of the Pacific. For years, the Zero had given them confidence not just because it was fast and agile, but because they believed their skill and machine together made them untouchable. When the Corsair arrived, that belief began to collapse, not only because it was faster, not only because it could climb higher, not only because it carried overwhelming firepower, but because it simply would not die. Japanese pilots found themselves pouring bursts of cannon and machine gunfire into the bent, winged fighter, only to watch it shrug off the punishment, keep flying, and often return fire with devastating results. This resilience became legendary among American pilots and terrifying among their enemies. The Corsair was built with survivability in mind. Its cockpit was armored, its wings and fuselage strengthened, and most importantly, it carried self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented the instant infernos that plagued so many Japanese aircraft. In contrast, the Zero's design philosophy had always been one of sacrifice. Armor and protection were stripped away to keep the plane light, giving it agility and range but leaving it fragile. A single hit in the wrong place could turn a Zero into a fireball, often killing the pilot before he had a chance to escape. Japanese pilots knew this. but they accepted it as the price of flying what they once considered the superior machine. Against Wildcats and other early American fighters, that gamble made sense. Against the Corsair, it became suicide time, and again, Japanese aviators watched their own bullets spark and flash against the Corsair's armored body without bringing it down. Reports told of Corsairs returning to base riddled with holes, wings shredded, fuselages peppered with damage, but still intact. Mechanics patched them up, pilots climbed back in, and the planes were ready to fight again. For Japanese pilots, this was deeply demoralizing. They risked everything in their attacks, closed to dangerous ranges, fired desperately, and yet too often they saw their efforts come to nothing. The realization crept in that, no matter how bravely they fought, no matter how many rounds they fired, the enemy had built a machine that could endure punishment their own planes could never survive. This resilience had a psychological ripple effect in combat. Japanese doctrine had long emphasized aggressive, decisive strikes, entering battle with confidence, closing quickly, and delivering deadly bursts at close range. Against fragile early American aircraft, this worked. Against the Corsair, it meant charging into a storm of .50 caliber fire while achieving little in return. Soon, Japanese pilots began to hesitate. The once aggressive attacks that had defined their tactics gave way to caution, to uncertainty, to fear of what might happen when the Corsair turned to face them. In war, hesitation is deadly. That fear and doubt translated into slower reactions, lost opportunities, and missed chances, tilting the balance of battle even further toward the Americans. The psychological contrast between the two machines could not have been more stark. American pilots climbed into their Corsairs with confidence, knowing their armor and durability gave them a chance to survive even if caught off guard. Japanese pilots climbed into their Zeros with the knowledge that one mistake, one burst of enemy fire, could end them instantly. That difference shaped behavior in the air. American pilots pressed attacks with boldness, sometimes taking risks because they knew their planes could take hits. Japanese pilots, once equally bold, began to feel the weight of vulnerability pressing down on them. They no longer believed they could afford mistakes, and that lack of belief was itself a weakness. Stories from the Pacific often illustrate the Corsair's reputation for resilience. Pilots returned with engines damaged, controls barely functioning, wings torn open, yet they managed to land and live to fight another day. These tales spread quickly among both American and Japanese forces, becoming part of the Corsair's legend. To Americans, it was a source of pride and confidence. To Japanese aviators, it was a source of dread. Each story reinforced the idea that the Corsair could not be killed, that even when they seemed to have the advantage, it would not last. That belief mattered as much as the machine itself, because it eroded morale in a way no technical specification could measure. The fear of the Corsair's resilience was not limited to individual pilots. It extended to Japanese command as well. Reports of high losses, of engagements where squadrons of Zeros were wiped out by smaller groups of Corsairs, forced leaders to confront the truth that their machines were obsolete. Yet production lines were slow, resources scarce, and replacements inadequate. The Zero remained Japan's frontline fighter, even as its weaknesses became impossible to deny. Every mission ordered was a gamble with men's lives, and every encounter with Corsairs seemed to prove the futility of continuing the fight on equal terms. Pilots went into battle knowing that they were flying aircraft that could not withstand punishment, while the enemy flew machines that could absorb it and strike back harder. This growing sense of futility wore down Japanese air power as much as the physical losses themselves. Morale dropped, confidence eroded, and the once proud spirit of the Imperial Japanese Navy's aviators dimmed. The Corsair's resilience was a symbol of the larger industrial and strategic imbalance between the two nations. America could build machines that survived, machines that protected their pilots, machines that returned again and again. Japan could not. For every Corsair patched up and sent back into combat, a Zero lost was a Zero gone forever, along with a pilot who could rarely be replaced. This disparity turned resilience into a weapon as powerful as speed or firepower, a constant reminder to Japanese pilots that they were fighting an enemy whose strength seemed endless. By the time the Corsair had fully established itself across the Pacific, its reputation was secure. Japanese pilots no longer charged into battle with the same confidence they had once carried. They no longer believed their skill alone could turn the tide. The resilience of the Corsair had broken not just their tactics, but their spirit. Each time they took to the skies, they carried the knowledge that their opponents flew machines built to endure, while they flew machines built to sacrifice. It was a psychological wound as deep as any inflicted by bullets or bombs, one that bled away their will to fight. In the end, the Corsair's resilience was more than armor and engineering. It was a symbol of inevitability, of a war that had turned against them and could no longer be won. The shift in air dominance during the Solomons and beyond was not sudden. It was a steady, grinding transformation that unfolded in the skies and was felt in the hearts of every pilot who fought there. In the early stages of the Pacific War, Japanese aviators ruled the skies with their Zero fighters, their reputations bolstered by lightning victories and the belief that no Allied plane could match them. Over Guadalcanal, over New Guinea, over the island chains where jungle met ocean, the Zero was a constant predator. But as 1942 gave way to 1943, the balance began to tilt. The Americans, battered but unbroken, introduced new machines, refined tactics, and trained waves of fresh pilots who had studied the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. The F4U Corsair became one of the clearest symbols of that change, its bent wings carving a new reality into the Pacific theater. The Solomons campaign was a crucible, a place where attrition wore down Japan's finest pilots and exposed the fragility of their doctrine. The airfields at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal became legendary for the relentless aerial battles that took place above them. In the early days, Japanese pilots flying Zeros often had the upper hand, but as months dragged on, replacements dwindled, and the quality of their aviators began to decline. At the same time, American pilots were gaining experience, sharpening their skills in brutal combat, and flying newer, stronger planes. By the time the Corsair appeared in numbers, the skies were no longer the arena of Japanese mastery. They were contested, bloody, and increasingly hostile to the Zero. The Corsair's performance in these battles accelerated the shift in dominance. Its speed, climb, and firepower gave American pilots the ability to dictate engagements, striking when it suited them and escaping when it did not. Japanese formations that once swarmed with confidence now found themselves harried from above, their tactical options stripped away. The Corsair fit perfectly into the boom and zoom style of fighting that American doctrine was evolving toward, a method that emphasized energy and survivability over tight-turning duels. In the Solomons, where chaotic dogfights erupted daily, this philosophy proved devastatingly effective. The Japanese still flew with courage, but courage could not overcome physics. Nor could it replace lost experience. The losses mounted in a way Japan could not afford. The Solomons became a graveyard for Japanese air power, bleeding away pilots who had trained for years and who could not be replaced quickly. Each clash with Corsairs and other advanced American fighters widened the gap. Meanwhile, American industry ensured that losses were replenished, squadrons were kept at strength, and pilots arriving fresh from training schools had the advantage of lessons learned by their predecessors. The Corsair was not just a machine, it was a manifestation of America's ability to outlast, outproduce, and eventually outfight its enemy. In the long struggle for the Solomons, that ability tipped the balance of the skies permanently. As the campaign spread beyond the Solomons into the wider Pacific, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, the Marianas, the pattern repeated itself. Wherever the Corsair flew, it carved away the last remnants of Japanese aerial dominance. Japanese pilots who had once entered battle believing in their superiority, now entered knowing they faced an enemy faster, stronger, and tougher. Accounts from this period often describe Japanese formations breaking earlier, refusing head-on engagements, or scattering in the face of Corsair attacks. The psychological tide had shifted. No longer did Americans fear the Zero. Now it was the Japanese who carried the burden of dread into every mission. The Solomons also revealed the difference in strategic endurance between the two nations. America could afford to lose planes and pilots, painful as it was, because replacements were always coming. Japan could not. By 1943, The once elite cadres of Japanese aviators had been decimated, replaced with younger, less experienced pilots who were rushed into combat with minimal training. Against Corsair veterans, these replacements stood little chance. The skies became an uneven battlefield, where quality and quantity both leaned heavily in favor of the Americans. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, became a symbol of obsolescence, and the Corsair became a symbol of inevitability. This shift in dominance was not only felt tactically, it was felt strategically. Control of the skies meant control of the seas and islands below. American bombers and transports moved more freely, supported and protected by fighters that Japanese interceptors could not stop. Naval operations became less risky, invasions more secure, and Japanese supply lines increasingly vulnerable. The Corsair's presence in these campaigns reinforced American control at every level, ensuring that Japanese forces could no longer operate with the freedom they once enjoyed. The Solomons campaign had proven that the tide had turned, and the battles that followed only deepened that truth. By late 1943 and into 1944, Japanese pilots flying into combat knew they were fighting uphill battles in every sense. They knew the Corsair was faster, that it could climb higher, that it could take damage they could not. They knew the balance of numbers was against them, and they knew that every loss further weakened their position. That knowledge drained their morale and eroded their once unshakable spirit. The shift in dominance was not just about machines. It was about the crushing of belief, the breaking of an illusion that had sustained Japanese air power in the early war. Once that belief was gone, no amount of bravery could bring it back. The story of the Solomons and beyond is the story of momentum changing hands, of a war that began with Japan's supremacy in the air and ended with America's. The Corsair was a defining element in that transformation, a machine that embodied the qualities Japan could no longer match. Its bent wings became a symbol of a new era, one where Japanese pilots no longer hunted with confidence but flew with fear, one where the skies of the Pacific were no longer contested ground but American territory. From the Solomons onward, the shift was irreversible. The Corsair had helped break Japan's hold on the air, and with it, the myth of invincibility that had once carried their pilots so high. U.S. Marine and Navy pilots quickly learned how to exploit the Corsair's strengths, turning it from a powerful machine into a weapon of dominance that reshaped the air war over the Pacific. The Corsair was not an easy aircraft to master. Its long nose made carrier landings difficult, its torque required careful handling, and its sheer power demanded skill. But in the hands of determined American aviators, those challenges became advantages. The Marines in particular embraced the Corsair, flying it from island airstrips carved out of jungle and coral, while Navy squadrons refined techniques to bring the bent, winged fighter safely onto carrier decks. Together, they forged a fighting style that maximized everything the Corsair had to offer: speed, climb, firepower, and resilience. What emerged was a deadly new approach to aerial combat that the Japanese could neither match nor counter. One of the first strengths American pilots exploited was speed. They quickly realized that with the Corsair, they no longer had to fight on the Zero's terms. Instead of turning and twisting in desperate dogfights, they used hit and run tactics, diving from altitude, unleashing devastating bursts from 6.50 caliber guns, and then climbing away before the Japanese could respond. This boom and zoom style perfectly matched the Corsair's performance profile and neutralized the Zero's greatest asset: agility. Marines flying from rough airstrips across the Solomons used this method with devastating effect, swooping down on Japanese formations, scattering them with deadly fire, and vanishing back into the clouds. Navy squadrons soon followed suit, rewriting the rules of carrier air combat to favor speed and firepower over finesse and turn fighting. The Corsair's climb rate was another strength pilots exploited ruthlessly. They learned that altitude was life, that holding the high ground meant dictating every engagement. With the Corsair's ability to rocket skyward, American squadrons often began battles from above, forcing the Japanese to fight uphill. When a Zero tried to follow, it stalled and fell back, becoming easy prey. American aviators took advantage of this relentlessly, drawing their opponents into vertical fights, where the Corsair always had the edge. In training and combat alike, They emphasized energy tactics, teaching new pilots to conserve speed, strike decisively, and climb away rather than bleed energy in futile turning duels. By mastering this approach, they turned the Corsair's power into a tactical doctrine that eroded Japanese confidence day by day. Firepower was exploited most brutally of all. American pilots quickly realized that their 6 Browning machine guns were more than just weapons. They were executioners. They didn't need long bursts or prolonged duels. A 2-second squeeze of the trigger was enough to rip a Zero apart. Corsair pilots refined their gunnery, learning to fire short, controlled bursts that maximized ammunition while delivering maximum destruction. Squadron tactics often involved coordinated strikes, with multiple Corsairs diving on the same formation, their combined firepower overwhelming Japanese defenses in seconds. Against such concentrated fury, Japanese units collapsed quickly, their fragile Zeros disintegrating under streams of lead they could neither dodge nor absorb. Pilots described the satisfaction of watching enemy aircraft shatter and burn, their confidence growing with every victory. Another strength Marines and Navy aviators exploited was the Corsairs' resilience. They knew their planes could take hits and bring them home, and that knowledge emboldened them. Stories of Corsairs landing with shredded wings, bullet-riddled fuselages, or smoking engines became part of squadron lore, reinforcing the belief that the aircraft would not abandon its pilot. This gave aviators the courage to press attacks aggressively, even when conditions were dangerous. They could dive into enemy formations with less fear of being crippled by a single lucky shot, something Japanese pilots could never claim in their fragile Zeros. That resilience also meant squadrons stayed stronger for longer. Planes that might have been lost in other air forces were patched up, refueled, and sent back into battle. Keeping American numbers consistently high, Marine squadrons in particular developed a reputation for ferocity with the Corsair. Flying from island bases in the Solomons, they fought in brutal conditions, sometimes launching missions from rough strips under constant attack. Yet the Corsair gave them the edge they needed. Pilots like Gregory Pappy Boyington of the famed Black Sheep Squadron became legends, exploiting the Corsair's strengths to rack up astonishing kill counts. Boyington himself claimed dozens of victories, many of them in Corsair cockpits, proving that in skilled hands, the bent-wing bird was not just a fighter, but a force multiplier. These exploits inspired confidence across the Marines and Navy alike, cementing the Corsair's reputation as the scourge of the Pacific skies. The Navy, too, refined its use of the Corsair. Early difficulties with carrier landings had led to doubts, but persistent training and technical adjustments turned those weaknesses into manageable challenges. Once fully deployed on carriers, the Corsair extended American air dominance deep into Japanese territory, escorting bombers, striking ships, and sweeping enemy fighters from the skies. Navy pilots exploited the Corsair's long range to cover missions across vast ocean expanses, ensuring American fleets could operate without fear of Japanese air attack. The ability to project such power across thousands of miles of ocean was a strategic revolution, and it was made possible by pilots who had mastered the Corsair's strengths. Perhaps the greatest strength Marines and Navy pilots exploited was psychological. They understood the fear the Corsair inspired in Japanese opponents, and they used it. By flying aggressively, by striking suddenly and relentlessly, they reinforced the sense of inevitability that weighed on enemy pilots. Every time a Zero was set ablaze by a short burst, every time a Japanese pilot broke off early to avoid combat, the Corsair's legend grew. American aviators exploited not only the technical superiority of their planes, but the crumbling morale of their opponents, turning fear itself into a weapon. By the time the Corsair was fully integrated into Marine and Navy squadrons, its strengths were no longer just technical specifications. They were doctrines, habits, and strategies etched into the very way Americans fought. Pilots had learned how to use speed to escape, climb to dominate, firepower to annihilate, and resilience to survive. They had turned the Corsair into more than a fighter. They had turned it into a symbol of American superiority, a machine that embodied the will and ability to win. Japanese pilots may have entered combat with courage, but against Marine and Navy Corsairs, courage was not enough. The Americans had mastered their weapon, and they exploited every strength it offered until the skies of the Pacific were theirs. Eyewitness accounts of Japanese pilots refusing head on battles with the Corsair became one of the most telling signs that the balance of power in the Pacific skies had permanently shifted. In the early war years, Japanese aviators in their Zeros were bold and aggressive. They did not hesitate to press frontal attacks, knowing their agility, firepower, and discipline often gave them the upper hand. American pilots dreaded those moments when the enemy came straight at them, cannons flashing, because their own aircraft were slower, more fragile, and often outmatched. But by 1943 and 1944, with the Corsair now cutting through the clouds, those roles had reversed. Accounts from both American and Japanese sources describe a striking change. When faced with the bent, winged bird, Japanese pilots often broke away rather than face the hurricane of firepower that awaited them. The reason was simple but devastating. A head-on duel with a Corsair was almost suicide. The 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in its wings unleashed a solid wall of lead that few aircraft could withstand, and the Zero, with its light frame and lack of armor, had virtually no chance of surviving. American pilots quickly realized this and began to exploit it, diving directly at Japanese formations and daring them to accept the challenge. Many times, the Zeros broke away, scattering before the Corsairs even opened fire. For the Americans, it was a stunning reversal of fortune. They were no longer the ones avoiding frontal clashes. Instead, they flew with confidence, knowing their opponents feared the very encounters they once sought. Reports from squadrons across the Pacific emphasize this pattern. Pilots wrote in their diaries about how Japanese fighters that once charged fearlessly now veered off, choosing to disengage rather than press the attack. Radio chatter often captured the surprise of American aviators who expected a furious exchange, but instead watched their enemies peel away. Some described it as a visible sign of the enemy's loss of confidence, a moment where the psychological tide of the war became undeniable. Where once Zeros had been symbols of terror, now they seemed hesitant, almost cautious, shadows of their former selves. The Corsair had not just changed tactics. It had changed the very spirit of the men who faced it. Japanese accounts, too, confirm this shift. Pilots wrote of the dread of facing the Corsair head, of knowing that its speed meant it would close the distance too quickly, of knowing that its firepower meant any miscalculation would be fatal. Many admitted that they avoided those duels whenever possible, preferring to seek other angles of attack or escape altogether. This was not cowardice, it was survival. By 1943, Japan's pool of experienced aviators was dwindling, and every pilot lost was irreplaceable. Commanders often reminded their men to avoid wasteful confrontations, to preserve themselves for battles where they might at least have a chance. The Corsair turned frontal attacks into traps, and the Japanese, already stretched thin, could not afford to throw lives away against them. American aviators used these refusals to their advantage, pressing head on approaches again and again to force Japanese fighters into defensive maneuvers. Each time a Zero turned away, it exposed itself to follow-up strikes. Each time it refused combat, it ceded the psychological high ground. Marines flying Corsairs from island airstrips described using the tactic deliberately, charging directly into formations, scattering them before a shot was fired, then pouncing on the disorganized stragglers. Navy pilots on carriers adopted the same methods, turning the Corsair into a spearhead that broke Japanese attacks before they could even form. The refusal of head on duels thus became more than just a symptom of fear. It became a tool for American victory. For the Japanese, this shift carried enormous psychological weight. In their training and doctrine, courage and aggression were prized above all. To turn away from battle was shameful, yet survival demanded it. Pilots found themselves caught between cultural ideals and practical reality, knowing that pressing head on against a Corsair meant almost certain death. Some chose to fight anyway and paid with their lives, their planes erupting in fire under streams of .50 caliber fire. Others chose to live and carried the heavy burden of retreat. Over time, the repeated refusal of these engagements spread demoralization throughout Japanese air units, weakening not only their tactical effectiveness, but their sense of honor and pride. American pilots, by contrast, thrived on the change. Every time they saw enemy planes break away, their confidence grew. They no longer entered battles with the tension of underdogs. They entered with the certainty of predators. This confidence fueled aggressive tactics, bolder missions, and greater successes. The Corsair had given them not only the tools to win, but the assurance that they could not be beaten in a fair fight. In aerial warfare, where seconds and decisions determine life and death, that assurance was as powerful as any bullet. By late 1944, the refusal of Japanese pilots to engage head-on had become so common that it was taken for granted. The Corsair's reputation preceded it, spreading fear before it even arrived. Japanese formations often broke at the mere sight of its bent wings, unwilling to test their luck against the wall of fire they knew awaited them. Eyewitness accounts describe battles that ended almost before they began, with Corsair squadrons scattering their enemies and then methodically hunting them down. The once proud Zeros had been reduced to prey, their pilots haunted by the knowledge that they could neither outgun, outrun, nor even outface the Corsair. The refusal of head-on combat was the clearest signal of how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. It was not just a tactical choice. It was the death of the old Japanese confidence, the collapse of the myth of the Zero, and the rise of the Corsair as the undisputed master of the Pacific skies. For the Americans, it was proof that they had turned the tide. For the Japanese, it was a daily reminder that the war in the air was no longer theirs to win. The Corsair's role in breaking Japan's myth of aerial invincibility was not only measured in statistics or wreckage scattered across Pacific skies. It was written in the shattered morale of the men who once believed the Zero made them untouchable. In 1941 and 1942, Japan's fighter pilots entered battle with a near religious certainty that their aircraft and training guaranteed victory. The Zero was their sword, and their spirit was the shield. In those years, that belief seemed justified. They outflew, outfought their enemies in battle after battle. But by 1943 and 1944, the bent, winged Corsair appeared, and with it came a cold, undeniable truth. The age of Japanese air supremacy was over. Every time the Corsair dove from the sun, every time it climbed away untouchable, every time its 6.50 calibers shredded a Zero in seconds, another piece of the myth cracked away. The Corsair represented everything the Zero was not. It was fast where the Zero was outpaced, durable where the Zero was fragile, heavily armed where the Zero was light. More than a fighter, it was a symbol of America's industrial might, proof that Japan could no longer match its enemy in quality or quantity. Japanese pilots, who had once believed that sheer skill and courage could bridge any gap, now faced a machine that erased those advantages. Even the most experienced aces found themselves powerless against the Corsair's speed and firepower. Stories of veterans being cut down despite years of triumph spread quickly through squadrons, reminding young pilots that no amount of bravery could overcome the gulf between the two machines. The psychological impact of this was immense. Pilots who had once taken to the skies with confidence now climbed into their cockpits with dread. They still fought, many with extraordinary courage, but they no longer believed in inevitable victory. Each encounter with Corsairs reinforced the sense of futility, the awareness that they were flying outdated machines into battles they could not win. This loss of belief eroded the aggressive spirit that had once made Japanese aviators so dangerous. Where once they pressed attacks relentlessly, they now hesitated, broke away, or scattered. The Corsair had not only outperformed their aircraft, it had pierced the heart of their doctrine. The myth that Japanese airmen were invincible warriors of the sky. American pilots sensed this shift and exploited it mercilessly. They flew with growing boldness, using the Corsair's strengths to dominate every encounter. They knew the enemy feared frontal attacks, knew the enemy could not match their climbs or outrun their dives. Confidence radiated through Corsair squadrons, transforming the way battles were fought. Instead of clinging to survival, they hunted. Instead of reacting to Japanese moves, they dictated the fight. In every clash, the legend of the Zero withered a little more, replaced by the legend of the Corsair, a fighter whispered about by enemy pilots as something unstoppable, something they feared even before seeing it. The breaking of the myth had broader consequences beyond individual battles. Air superiority is not just about planes in the sky. It shapes the entire course of a war. Once Japanese pilots lost faith in their dominance, their ability to protect bombers, ships, and bases collapsed. Corsair-equipped units swept the skies clear, allowing American bombers to strike deeper, fleets to sail safer, and invasions to proceed with overwhelming air cover. Each step forward in the Pacific was paved by control of the skies, and the Corsair was a central part of ensuring that control. Its role was not only tactical but strategic, breaking not just enemy formations, but the very idea that Japan could still command the air. For Japanese leadership, the shattering of aerial invincibility was catastrophic. Their doctrine had relied heavily on the myth of the zero, and the belief that their pilots' skill could overcome material disadvantages. When that myth was broken, it exposed the reality of Japan's dwindling resources, its inability to replace losses, and its increasingly desperate situation. Pilots still flew and still fought, but each sortie was carried out under the shadow of inevitability. The Corsair embodied that inevitability. It was the harbinger of defeat, the proof that no amount of courage could compensate for a lack of technological and industrial power. Against the bent, winged bird, Japan's aerial empire crumbled piece by piece. Eyewitnesses often described how the sight of Corsairs diving into battle scattered Japanese formations before a single shot was fired. That fear, that instinctive recognition of futility, showed how deeply the myth had been broken. The once proud image of Japanese fighters as predators had been replaced by the reality of prey fleeing the shadow of a stronger hunter. American pilots wrote of how battles became one-sided slaughters, of how Corsairs returned with victory after victory while their enemies left only trails of smoke and flame. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical losses, and by the final years of the war, Japan's once vaunted air forces were reduced to shadows of their former selves. In the end, the Corsair's greatest achievement was not only in the wreckage it left behind, but in the fear it instilled. It destroyed more than aircraft. It destroyed illusions. The myth of Japanese aerial invincibility, once so powerful and pervasive, could not withstand the reality of a machine that outflew, outclimbed, and outgunned everything Japan sent against it. For American pilots, the Corsair was a savior, a weapon that gave them dominance and survival. For Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare, the proof that the skies they once ruled now belonged to someone else. In the clash between myth and machine, the Corsair was the executioner, and with every victory, it buried the legend of the zero deeper, leaving only smoke, fire, and the end of an empire's dream of supremacy in the skies.